I'll be talking about the tool that we've developed for assessing climate change-driven losses and damages. And below you can see all the organizations that were part of the ICAT adaptation project that Henning briefly introduced. And for that reason, I don't have to talk about the project at length or even briefly as I wanted to in this slide, but this gives you an overview of what we were trying to achieve, the countries we've been working in as pilot countries, and also the areas they've been working in, developing methodologies that we then used to draw upon and develop the methodologies that we are presenting today. So the objective of assessing climate change-driven losses and damages is to provide methodological elements for assessing these losses and damages at national level. And understanding these the challenges that we face, the types of measures required, and to address these challenges, that's the rationale for developing this guidance document. And as usually is the case, the national level country officials in the governments are our target audience here. So I apologize for this rather full slide, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the principles and the framing that we need to understand in order to address losses and damages. So the IPCC defines climate change impacts as the consequences of realized risks on natural and human systems. And then the risks themselves are the interaction of climate hazards, and exposures and vulnerabilities to these hazards, right? And then these impacts generally refer to effects on lives, on livelihoods, on health and well-being, on ecosystems, species, economic, social, cultural assets, services, and infrastructure. So these are the areas in which we see impacts take place that we can then look at. Now, it's important to note that the Paris Agreement looks at losses and damages in a slightly different way by recognizing the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. This ultimately talks much about the connection between mitigation, adaptation, and residual risk, which then materializes in the form of losses and damages. Averting loss and damage is mitigation. Minimizing loss and damage is adaptation. And addressing loss and damage is what we have to do when climate hazards hit people who are vulnerable, for instance, in specific locations. So this is why the Paris Agreement takes a different or slightly broader perspective, whereas in this guide, we talk about the closer or narrower definition used under the IPCC, actually. But I want to talk a little bit about this figure on the right-hand side here. You can see on the y-axis, we have levels of risk from undetectable to moderate to high to very high rising. And then on the x-axis, you can see from present-day considerations to the end of this century, climate risks are rising in each of these two scenarios, high emission scenario, low emission scenario. This is not a temperature scenario. What you see here is a risk increase scenario where we have a high emission scenario, that is low climate mitigation. We have very, very high climate risks. But if we use strong adaptation, which is the brown button, the brown line, but the lower one, you can see that through that we can reduce climate risk very considerably. Now, if we manage to go for a strong mitigation trajectory, that means low emissions, low temperature increase, and much less climate risk increase, then we can, through adaptation, reduce the climate risk very, very strongly. That's why we can see here on the right-hand side, the residual risk can be very low with strong mitigation and strong adaptation. It can be very weak with with low mitigation and low adaptation. So the residual risk, which eventually turns into losses and damages, is what we need to deal with. But we have to think about the bigger picture, which means we have to think about mitigation and adaptation at the same time, as these will ultimately reduce the losses and damages we have to deal with in the future. So this figure basically just expands on what I was talking about before. You know, when we have effective adaptation, it avoids the impacts. When adaptation measures are either insufficient or ineffective, we end up having damages or we end up having losses. And the difference between damages and losses, as it's defined here, is that the damages are reversible or irreversible, but they're reparable. That means we can fix things. Whereas losses, we cannot fix them. They cannot be reverted. And here's some other characteristics that distinguish losses from damages. So we already heard about the reversibility or reparability of losses and damages. The second point to consider is that damages are suitable for risk-based measures, whereas losses are not suitable for risk-based measures. Because when we have a loss, then there is no risk-based measure that can make the loss undone. There is a big difference in the amount of finance needed for damages, which is much greater typically than for losses. And again, in terms of the way the climate negotiations talks about losses and damages, adaptation and loss and damage are connected to damages, whereas losses are only connected to loss and damage. So let's look at assessing damages a bit more specifically. The objective is to assess the costs of climate impacts and needs to which damages require reconstruction or rehabilitation. There are some important parameters to consider: the severity of the impacts, the tolerance level of the population. For instance, populations used to drought are less affected by drought than those populations that are not typically exposed to high levels of drought. And then we need to look at the differences between the drivers of damages. They can be climate related and they can be non-climate related, and we obviously focus on those that are climate related. We look at different dimensions of damages. First, we have direct damages, like the bridge broken here on the right-hand side. But then, in addition, there are indirect damages that we need to look at, and I'll talk more about those. Then there are differences in terms of past and likely future assessments of or damages that will occur. You know, one is looking ex post and what has happened, and the other is looking into the future, what is likely going to happen. And I'll talk more about that too. Then we have to distinguish between local and national levels of government involved in assessing damages. And here we can say that the national level often takes sort of the planning and overarching perspective, whereas the damages themselves typically hit at the local level, and building connections between the local and the national level is therefore really critical for assessing loss and damage, as is the case for adaptation more generally. Then we have different types of assessments. We have quantitative versus qualitative information that needs to be assessed. And then we have different types of climate events, extreme events like cyclones, hurricanes, floods, and slow onset events such as sea level rise. So looking backwards and forwards, the retrospective assessments build on different forms of information that where we already know what's happened through, and we can produce reports here that help us understand how to deal with the disaster risk reduction. And then we can build on standard meteorological records to help us identify the standard conditions vis-a-vis the extreme conditions that are important. Looking forward, we focus on modeling to assess future climate conditions, the future expected hazards, and then information on vulnerability and exposure that we can anticipate from development dynamics like population movements, where people live, and changes in the vulnerability through income, for instance, and health access. These are ways to assess how in the future people and systems will be exposed or vulnerable to the hazards that are increasing. In terms of the indirect impacts, which can often be much greater than the direct impacts, we need to consider gender, which is often leads to a bias in terms of the economic outcomes of damages, for instance, through excess burden or of domestic work, spillover effects. Here we have damages occurring in one sector that have negative repercussions in other sectors, and then macroeconomic impacts such as lost tax revenue, strained public finance, reduced economic activity, increased consumer prices through inflation, and reduced employment and income. All of these can be consequences of a damage that happens and need to be considered in our damage assessment. We also need counterfactuals, because when we treat with damages, we need to compare that to what would be the outcome of either the normal expected variation of damages, or in cases where we are looking forward to actually reducing the exposure or vulnerability of people and systems to the hazards, we could use counterfactuals as ways of assessing the avoided damages that we can then use as a means of justifying action. So for past damages, we can use national statistics, we can use standardized data from other countries, and for future damage assessments, we use econometric methods, statistical methods, and others that help us understand, including through heuristic methods and expert judgment, help us understand how the future is likely going to look like and how avoiding these damages today would justify the investments that we're making. So now we come briefly to conducting the assessment. We have to also consider data from the bottom, that is from the local level, which is often not available or only available with great difficulty, versus top-down data, which typically doesn't have as much disaggregation. So in many cases, only top-down data will be available, and bottom-up data can be collected and should be developed in the form of a monitoring and evaluation system that connects the national level sort of framework with local level information and aggregates that in ways that help the country understand where there are challenges in planning for the impacts in the future. And then finding that information will be much easier going forward. I think the assessment levels that we look at really depend often on the availability of data, but also on the scope of the damages that we're trying to assess. Each of the damage categories that you can see on the right, infrastructure, water, sanitation, power generation, transport, telecommunications, education, health, housing, and economic sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, services, or tourism. For each of these categories, we need to collect state level, that is what the state is, and economic impact indicators for the different damage categories. And therefore, that helps us then understand what kinds of damages we might be facing given different types of climate hazards that might strike. We also need to look at the institutional considerations around the assessment of damages. Using the Sendai framework is a good way to ensure minimum standards for metadata, and building synergies with other national data collection and monitoring mechanisms also avoids multiplying work, redundancy, saves costs, and is generally a good thing to do. So looking broader than just focusing on damages related to climate change is a useful way to making sure that available data is already collected and used effectively for the damage assessments. Then, obviously, we need to build the awareness and the capacity at all levels of society, national, subnational to local, in order to develop an effective damage assessment framework. And then, lastly, it's important to integrate damage and the management of losses and damages into the legislation, into policy, to make sure that there is a working framework and delivery system to collect and aggregate information around losses and damages. So coming now to the assessment of losses, which is really quite different from the assessment of damages. There's much more information around damages than there is for losses. And losses in this case are difficult to deal with. It's not something that you can just easily translate into money or other financial indicators, because losses are different depending on cultures, on gender, on age, and other parameters. And it will therefore be difficult to say where losses end or begin. And we need to look at this in a case-by-case basis. So the objective of the assessment then is to first identify the choice of assessment method and figure out in order to figure out what the losses we are dealing with. And then lastly, we need to look at the drivers of the losses and determine each driver's relative contribution to prevent losses in the future. And I want you to look at the picture on the right, because on the foreground, you can see where the glacier was in 1995 and where it is today. That glacier is lost, at least in timeframes that are relevant for us. And we can't see this coming back unless we go to temperature levels close to pre-industrial levels. How long is that going to take? Operationalizing losses. So I already talked about the exceedance of adaptation limits that lead to loss. And adaptation limits are exceeded when we are deprived of something, where something here can be people or creatures, objects, places, experiences, opportunities that are both considered irreplaceable and indispensable for our well-being. And the exceedance of these adaptation limits is based on values, which may be different across communities and even across individuals. So therefore, losses can really only be effectively assessed at community and individual levels. I think that needs to be expanded. In some cases, we can actually assess losses at different levels. The guide talks about different categories of losses: human mobility and territory, like losing your homeland if you're living on an atoll country, in the South Pacific, for instance, cultural heritage and indigenous knowledge. If you look at the right picture on the right bottom, you can see the Omiwatari ceremony on Lake Suwa in Japan, which takes place when ice comes together on this large lake and then builds this strange forms and makes strange noises. But this will no longer be possible because there will no longer be ice on this lake in the future. So that's a major loss. Another loss is human life and health and well-being. You can see the body bags after people drowned or died in the floods in Pakistan in 2022. Biodiversity losses, as this polar bear, you can see, looking at the shrinking ice, that it needs to survive. So all of these are different categories of losses that we need to consider. To collect our data, we do use different assessment methods. We can use literature, expert interviews, interviews with focus groups, stories. All of these things are important in collecting information relevant to losses. We can have different sampling approaches. Deep and narrow, for instance, would be that we go very deeply into a very small number of questions with small number of individuals or communities, versus broad and shallow, where we try to cover a much bigger range of people or communities, but obviously don't have the ability to go as deeply as in other ways. And maybe there are ways of connecting these two. So just two more slides with links, not links, but important documents that you might want to refer to in addressing losses and damages. And I thank you for your attention.